I give the stage to you. We cannot currently see you video-wise, but we can definitely hear you, Denny. So yes, thank you very much, and the stage is yours.
Oh, that's interesting. You can't see the video, actually. I thought you could do both.
No, we can't.
So let's have the slides, and then we can switch off the slides when we later talk. Thank you so much, Maximilian, for the introduction. Thank you for having me here, and thank you all for coming. I'll, as Maximilian said, I keep the talk short so that we can have a lot of space for discussion. And the ones who've seen the talk before, I'm sorry for the repetition. So I joined the Wikimedia Foundation last year in order to make this project of Wiki Functions and Abstract Wikipedia happen. And the reason I'm doing it for the Wikimedia Foundation is the mission of the foundation. The mission of the foundation is to imagine a world where everyone can share in the sum of all knowledge. So, given that Wikipedia this year turned 20, it's a good time to take a step back and wonder where we are with regards to that goal. So Wikipedia is available in more than 300 languages, and we have more than 57 million articles. So that sounds pretty good, right? But the problem is that the knowledge is very unevenly distributed. On the one hand side, we have English with more than 6 million articles. I mean, we have an article for every single Simpsons episode and many other small things. So it's really, the coverage looks pretty good. But then we go to a language like Hausa, and Hausa is a language with 60 million native speakers. It's spoken in Western Africa. It has 30 million second language speakers. So it's a huge language, but we have like less than 12,000 articles. So the coverage in Hausa is much, much less complete than it is in English. But it's not just, English has everything. The other languages are all lagging behind. So we have those 4 million articles in English. German is our second largest Wikipedia by activity. It's the second most active community that we have. They have about 2.6 million articles. Doesn't sound bad. The interesting thing is that if you look at the overlap, they only cover 1.2 million common topics. So in fact, about half of the articles that are available in German are not available in English. So there's a lot of knowledge in the German Wikipedia that is not available in the English Wikipedia. And this goes all the way down to Hausa. So even in Hausa, we have about 5% of all the Hausa articles are not available in English. There's a lot of knowledge that we have in Hausa, which is not available in English or many other languages. This includes articles about female authors, female filmmakers, actresses, makeup artists, singer-songwriters, and entrepreneurs. In fact, of the 20 million topics that have Wikipedia articles, only about a third is covered by the English Wikipedia. So even in English Wikipedia, which is by far our largest, there's so much knowledge that is not available to English readers. But looking just at the number of articles gives a very, very coarse number. So the English article about Marie Curie, for example, it's long. It's like an essay. You can read a lot of detail and so on. If you go to Amharic, a language spoken in Eastern Africa, it's only a single sentence. And if you go to Hausa, there's nothing. There's no article about Marie Curie. So just the number of articles is also not just numbers is too coarse, but it shows a little bit what we are missing. The core problem is that the community sizes are very different. So we have about 69,000 active Wikipedians. Active contributors is a specific terminology, which means they do more than 5 edits every month in order to be counted. So in reality, the number of contributors is actually in the hundreds of thousands. But here we take a more active definition of the contributor. Almost half of those are working on the English Wikipedia, 31,000. And as soon as we go, for example, to German, I said our second most active community, it drops down to 5,500. So many, many fewer people are there. And in other languages, it's even, there are only 11 languages where we have 1,000 contributors or more. And in half of our languages, we have 10 or fewer contributors. Now, writing and maintaining a current, comprehensive, and correct encyclopedia with 10 people in their spare time, that's a challenge. And I would say we're probably going to fail in all of those languages. So a world where everyone can share in the sum of our knowledge, I think we're pretty far away from that still. How could the core problem of that is that the cost of Wikipedia fundamentally is the number of topics we want to cover times the number of languages we want to support. And the question that we're asking for Abstract Wikipedia is, can we take this multiplication and turn it into an addition? And I'm going to, in the rest of the talk about how. Because in that case, we can reduce the cost of Wikipedia by more than 2 orders of magnitude and bring it to a space where we know that we actually can deal with that. The movement has been working towards this already. So this is the Urdu article on Marie Curie. These blue parts, the top and the side, they come from MediaWiki. They're already being translated. The red parts, the info box, references, language links, the authority control files at the bottom, they are already not maintained locally anymore in a language like Urdu, but they all come from Wikidata. Maximilian has already pointed out to it. What is Wikidata? So Wikidata is an editable knowledge graph, structured data about all kind of topics that are in Wikipedia and well beyond, written in a language independent way. What does it mean to be written in a language independent way? So this is the English view on Marie Curie, on the Marie Curie item in Wikidata. We see, for example, that she's a human. We see that she's part of Marie Curie, and there's much more information on this page. Dozens of statements about Marie Curie. And the thing is, we don't have just all of this in English. We can actually just switch over to a different language like Hindi or Estonian or Hebrew or Arabic. And in fact, Wikidata is available in more than 400 languages. And the thing is, unlike the Wikipedias, where those languages are all independently maintained and curated, in Wikidata, we are all working on the same knowledge graph, and then we just display it in the different languages. So in Wikidata, every item is always available in every language. We can see all the information about it, no matter what language we speak. Sometimes it's being shown with a different label because we don't have a label in that language, but it is always available. Everything is always available. It's always the same knowledge. It's available in all the languages. So, and if someone edits something, say in German, it will be immediately visible in Hebrew on Wikidata. If someone adds something in Estonian, it will be immediately available in Hausa and also in Urdu. So if we go then down on the page, we can, for example, see identifiers to different memory institutions like galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, and many others ones where we say, okay, Marie Curie is all the same like those identifiers. And that turns Wikidata into a form of modern Rosetta Stone. With the difference that we don't have only 3 different identifiers who are aligned with each other, but we actually link to more than 6,400 different linked catalogs where you can get more information about the content, about the topic in Wikidata. Wikidata currently has more than 95 million items which are described there, with more than 1.3 billion statements. Wikidata currently has more than 22,000 contributors that contribute each month, and in total, Wikidata has seen more than 400,000 contributors working on the knowledge graph in Wikidata. They have so far amassed almost 1.5 billion edits, and in fact, last year, Wikidata became the first wiki to have crossed more than 1 billion edits. It was only last year, we already at 1.5 now. The English Wikipedia has actually followed this feat. This year, just in time for its 20th anniversary, English Wikipedia also crossed 1 billion edits. The number that's most surprising for me is that every day we see about 16 million Sparkle queries going to Wikidata. What's a Sparkle query? So given that we have the structured information knowledge graph about all the items and how they're connected and so on, we can actually query this knowledge graph with a query language. Sparkle is a standard query language for graphs. And so you can ask, for example, like a query like, give me all the people who have studied at Tallinn University, for example. And then you can also say, and show me the pictures which are taken from comments. And the nice thing about a Sparkle endpoint is you can't just ask this kind of queries and get live results, but you can also visualize these results in many interactive ways. So what we see here is actually directly an output from the Sparkle endpoint, written without a single line of code. It's just the Sparkle query, and then we get the result back. For example, like here, we see people who studied at Tallinn University. Here, another example. Here, this is more interesting. What we take here is paintings by Vermeer, in which collection or museum they are, the location of these museums, the geolocation, and then take those and put them on an OpenStreetMap, and adding the images of the paintings from Wikimedia Commons. And this then leads to an interactive visualization. You can click on the dots, you can see the paintings. And all of this, again, without writing a single line of code. It's just a query, and coming directly out of the Sparkle query engine, you can take those results, embed them in your website, and anything else. Another example, one last example, Marie Curie. This is Marie Curie's academic genealogy. We see the supervisor of Marie Curie's PhD thesis. We see the supervisors of them, and so on. So it goes back to Gabriel Lippmann, Hermann von Helmholtz, and so on. It goes back for centuries, actually. And you can see the whole genealogy of Marie Curie, and it's interactive, and you can just go into the query and you can change the person and see it for other academics, and so on. And this information that Marie Curie's supervisors, Gabriel Lippmann, is here in Wikidata, and this is the same information that is being displayed, for example, on the Urdu Wikipedia in the info box, but being displayed in Urdu, saying the PhD advisor is Gabriel Lippmann. You can see the same information when you go to the Welsh Wikipedia. It's being displayed in the info box directly from Wikidata. You can see it in the Romanian article, in the Slovenian, Belarusian, Greek, Czech, Azeri. A growing number of Wikipedias are relying on data in Wikidata, which is exactly how we can reduce the cost of Wikipedia to the number of topics plus the number of languages, because all this information now is being maintained in only a single place and then being displayed in all the different languages. So what we have to do is bring everything from Wikipedia to Wikidata, and we're done, right? Nothing else to do. The problem is it's not that easy. There's a lot of things that we could, so this is basically just this thing in the middle needs to be expressed. But the thing is that this is actually the hardest thing by far. And the expressivity of Wikidata doesn't really allow it. You can't do narration in Wikidata. You can't do reference by description. You can't do redundancy. For now, I quickly skip the narration and reference by description part. Let's focus on redundancy. What do I mean with that? So Wikidata is really bad at stating something that is already inferable for the rest of the data. And to give you one example, in basically every article of Marie Curie, no matter what the language is, whether it's German or Italian or Spanish or Chinese, Russian, in all of those languages, we have one fact that is being repeated in the opening of the article, even in the short Urdu article. This one fact is being repeated, and which means, because all these articles are written independently by each other, it means someone went into that article and wrote it into the top, and it stayed in the top for a pretty high profile article. So what is this information? This information is that she is the only person to win the Nobel Prize in 2 different scientific fields. This is said in all of those different languages and many more. No surprise, it's pretty important information. But this information is not explicit in Wikidata. It's implicit in Wikidata. You can ask, who are all the people who won the Nobel Prize in 2 different scientific fields? And you would get like, oh, it's Marie Curie. But nowhere on the Marie Curie article is this information explicitly recorded and stated, even though it's obviously important for all of us, because otherwise you wouldn't have seen it in all of those different articles. So let's take the sentence. And what can we do with it? We can't express it in Wikidata. Is there a different way to express it? And for knowledge representation, we have these ideas of frames or constructors, how you want to call them, that can express this kind of information. So we say, for example, well, let's take an only person that frame. The person is Marie Curie, and the condition is, well, the condition is a bit complicated. So let's use a frame again, nested in this upper frame of award winning. The award is the Nobel Prize, and here I'm doing a lot of hand waving. But this is basically the idea of how to express this kind of complex sentences inside of Abstract Wikipedia. The type of the award is, let's take a noun phrase with modifiers, and we have the determiner of 2. The modifiers are different than scientific, and the head is category. Now, it doesn't matter if this presentation really expresses exactly this sentence, or if it expresses a similar sentence, like the only one who ever won Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences was Marie Curie. What matters is that I can take the same abstract representation and turn it into a different language, like, for example, Croatian. Marie Curie je jedina osoba koja je dobila Nobelove nagradu 2 različita znanstvena područja. What is important, I can also turn it in Estonian, for example. And have the same. I don't have a clue about Estonian, so I just used Google Translate in this case, and I hope it's correct. And also on the other side, what is important is that I actually don't have English present, but I have here some abstract identifiers. Obviously, I wouldn't display those to human readers, but this is what we're being stored here, is the same abstract identifiers we have in Wikidata. So what we need are those constructors, like only person that has certain slots, that have certain fillers for them. We need plenty of those, and we need for each of those constructors, we need a renderer per language. So we need a renderer for English, we need a renderer for Estonian, and can take the same content and turn it into language. And then in that case, we can have this kind of abstract information. We can have the renderer, and it turns into a natural language text, which then the Wikipedias can use. Which is a bad example. We already have a pretty complete article about Marie Curie, so the English Wikipedia wouldn't use this sentence necessarily. But for other languages, or neither would Estonian, but for many other languages, this could provide a kind of baseline of knowledge that the Wikipedia can use, and instead of relying on their own text being written, have this come from the central repository and being displayed there to fill the gaps. Now, who is going to write all these renderers, the constructors, and so on? And my team at the foundation is obviously far too small for that, to write renderers in more than 300 languages. So what we are doing is introducing a new project, Wiki Functions, where people can write this kind of renderers, people can create those constructors, so we can agree on them collaboratively, and then use this for many different languages. Now we come to a new view of the content in Wikipedia. So we have Wikidata and Wiki Functions as founding blocks. And on top, we have all those contents that we're talking about. And there's only one per item now. We don't have independent articles in all the different languages. And what we need is a set of renderers in different languages, so we can take those contents, translate them into different languages, and display them. And this then truly turns the cost of Wikipedia into an addition of the topics and languages, because now the topics and the languages are completely independent of each other. So we have this, the current architecture, already halfway there actually. So the current architecture, we have the Wikipedias who can use the data in Wikidata, can use the items. What we still need to do is to add those abstract contents, and then they use the renderers in Wiki Functions, which are built on the constructors, also different Wiki Functions. And this then accesses the lexicographical data in Wikidata. I'll come to that back in a moment. So our goal is that content, constructors, renderers are maintained by the community. The system can be understood and edited predictably. And we have something called graceful degradation, which means if one word is missing, we don't stop the whole article, but just the part that we actually can't render. But even though the whole idea is very ambitious, we also have a few reasons for optimism. So first, we're only dealing with a single genre, which is encyclopedic text. It's not about, prose, it's not about flaming manifestos or whatever, but it's about encyclopedic text. And if encyclopedic text reads a little bit boring, that's okay. Second, we don't need to parse and understand language. We only have to generate it, which is a huge advantage. And we can start with a very simple and low baseline. We have a promising incentive infrastructure. And we have a very attractive goal in the end, which is to provide everyone with a way to share in the sum of our knowledge. So what's about Wiki Functions? So if we squint a little bit, so constructors, content, and renderers are terms that are not known by a lot of people. And this is a problem because, you know, Wikipedia success is mostly rooted on the fact that you can tell people, okay, it's an encyclopedia written in a wiki, everyone can join. And everyone knows what an encyclopedia is. The people can easily learn what a wiki is. So there we are. But for this one, if we talk about constructors, content, and renderers, we don't have a common understanding of what people are actually aiming for. So, but if we squint a little bit, the constructors really look at types in programming languages. Contents are values of those types, and renderers are just functions over those types. And in that case, we actually get to a much more general solution for the problem. And this is what Wiki Functions is actually taking up. So Wiki Functions aims to be an automatic question answering site in the sense that it's a lot of functions that you can actually run and implement. It's the first new Wikimedia project since 2012 when Wikidata launched. We're launching early next year, and it will be completely multilingual in terms of natural languages and programming languages. So what is a function? Mathematically, a function is a mapping from one set to elements of another set, but this is not very helpful. So maybe it's a bit more helpful if we regard functions as something that takes some input, runs an algorithm over it, some predictable recipes, changes it, and creates thus an output F from X. But also that's just a formal definition. What's really important is that functions are useful and functions are already exposed to you, for example, by the big tech companies. If you go to Siri and ask how many teaspoons in 2 tablespoons, well, that's the function being run and it gives you results for that. If you go to Bing and you can ask, when was Tallinn University founded? Again, what we do, and Bing is a search engine, but in this case, we don't actually get search results, but rather it looks up in its own knowledge graph. Satori gets the information and displays it here. It says in 2005, which is correct, but a bit simplifying given the history of the university. Now we can go, for example, to DuckDuckGo and ask how many days since March 18, 2005, the university was founded, and it'll tell you 6,022 days. So 3 weeks ago, you became 6,000 days old. Or you can go to Google, and this is my favorite example of functions. You can ask for the volume of a pyramid, and you get this beautiful experience where it shows you the sketch of a pyramid, it gives you the different parameters that you have, and you can enter all those values. It shows you the formula, it substitutes the values in the formula and gives you the results. So all of this works out of it. But the thing is, as soon as we move out of these carefully curated and implemented functions that the big search companies, that the big tech companies provide you, and we go and ask, for example, something like, how many women have an article in the House of Wikipedia? We fall back to 10 blue links, and basically not even them are particularly helpful. So, and that's maybe even the lucky part. If we actually just get 10 blue links instead of the system trying to answer you if you can't create an answer. If we ask, for example, for the dictionary entry of water, we get actually a pretty good solid representation. We get the different definitions of water, we get the different forms of water, and so on. So, but if I do the same thing, for example, for Estonian, and I ask, what's the plural genitive of the Estonian word vesi? Well, Google tries to answer that. It looks up, it sees it in dictionary, it finds a table and says, oh, the genitive of the plural, that's vesie. And we find this here. But the thing is, if you speak with Estonian, you actually know that's wrong. And what happens here is that Google fails to understand that the dictionary entry actually has entries for a number of different languages. And what it looks up is, instead of Estonian, it gets you the Votic language conjugation. And Votic, that's a language that has like 4 native speakers left. Like literally, there's just like 4 of them there. And instead of taking actually the answer from the Estonian one and displaying it here. Functions are knowledge, and knowledge really is power. And in fact, functions are a form of superpower because they not only answer your questions, they answered questions with confidence that have never been answered before. You can go to a function, you can plug in your parameters, and you get an answer back, and you can be pretty sure that it's a correct answer, even though it has never been checked for this, because you trust the function itself. And since functions are knowledge, this is something that the Foundation obviously cares about, because it's part of our mission. Here are a few mock-ups of how Wiki Functions could look like. So we could have functions for converting tablespoons to teaspoons, as we saw earlier with the Curie example. We could have functions for taking 2 dates and calculating how many days have passed since. Function to multiply positive integers. Let's look at this a bit more in detail. For each function, we could have several implementations in Wiki Functions. For example, one in JavaScript that just uses the native JavaScript multiplication. We can have one in Python, looks pretty much the same. We can have one in a composition. A composition now is interesting. It's not a new programming language that you haven't heard about, but what composition is that it takes existing functions in Wiki Functions and composes those together. And now the interesting thing about this is in Wiki Functions, it's like in Wikidata, everything is actually notified with numeric IDs, so-called set IDs. This means that all these functions here are set IDs. And what this means is that I can actually take this implementation, just like in Wikidata, and have it also be viewed in German or in Bengali. So I can edit, read, and run function implementations in Bengali. I don't have to write them in English anymore, which is usually the case in most programming languages. And for the first time, we want to make programming implementations accessible and maintainable by hundreds of millions, by billions of people who couldn't before, because they would need to speak English in order to do so. What we're aiming for with Wiki Functions is really democratize access to functions, democratize the creation of functions. We want to access those functions through many different modalities. Everyone should be able to call functions from Wiki Functions, and we want to create a natural language library in more than 300 languages by the community. What's also particularly interesting is there's been a paper in in Nature last year, which says that language aptitude correlates with programming capabilities, not STEM capabilities. And usually people think, oh, if I'm bad at STEM, I can't do programming. But there's actually no correlation there. So there is actually a huge pool of people who know natural languages who could be contributing to this project. We just have to convince and reach them. I don't know how to do that, but we're working towards it, to making the user interface as friendly as possible to get all these people to coding natural language generation functions. I'll end with a quick view on the lexicographic data in Wikidata, which is basically the foundation on how the natural language generation will work. So what we are working on in Wikidata is currently to create a large dictionary, or a machine-readable dictionary of words in Wikidata. This is something we started in 2018. And this is not the entry in Wikidata for the thing water, for the fluid, but it's for the English noun water. And what you can do, for example, is you can take structured data and, for example, visualize the etymology of water, going back to the Proto-Indo-European roots, and see all the other languages that come from the same root. What we have about water is all these definitions of water. We can say, okay, it's a common liquid substance, it's a chemical compound, it's a body of water, usually a river, lake, or ocean. So we have different senses, but we also have the different forms. And it says, for example, water. Well, we have singular and the plural, water and waters. English isn't particularly interesting with regards to forms on its nouns. If we go to Estonian, we get many, many more nouns. We also see, for example, the genitive plural we have been looking for earlier over here. And we say it's actually vete, not vesi, as Google was claiming. Wikidata currently has more than 500,000 lexemes in almost 800 languages. And we have close to 10 million forms about those lexemes. We have and describe them all with only 150,000 sentences. So there's a lot of space for improvement. And so far, more than 3 million edits have been working on this by about 2,000 contributors, about 100 of them being active, which is comparable to most of the dictionaries. The coverage is surprisingly good already in some languages. So English has a coverage of more than 90% compared to Wikipedia. In Estonian, we have a coverage of more than 80% compared to the Estonian Wikipedia, but it gets much worse in many other languages, particularly our focus languages like Bengali, Malayalam, Hausa, Igbo, and Dagbani. Those are the languages that we chose, or where the community actually chose with us, because the communities we're basically asking to become focus language, and we want to work with those communities very closely to create a dictionary, to create the natural language generation paths and so on. But we also do it for all the other languages. And so one of the first goals we want to have is actually those functions that take something like the Estonian noun, create the conjugations, and then we increase the coverage in Wikidata for the dictionary data, and this then will be used, all these terms will then be used in the natural language generation part. And admittedly, it's a little bit of a stretch to get, from something that creates the genitive plural of an Estonian noun to something that takes the only person that constructor and renders it in 300 different languages. But this is where we are working towards in the next few years. This year, we are completely focused on the development of Wiki Functions. Then we'll launch in next year. We want to add a focus on the Abstract Wikipedia for creating constructors, for adding them to Wikidata, and so that in 2023 we can actually have more people share in more knowledge across more languages, and therefore getting a meaningful step closer to a world where really everyone can share in the sum of our knowledge. Thank you for the attention, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion now. I'm heading back to Maximilian.
Yes, thank you very much. You can either unshare the screen or okay. Thank you. So this was very, very fascinating. I hope I didn't promise too much. I also learned more stuff since your last talk. So this is obviously having a huge potential, but coming with a lot of I wouldn't say problems, but there's lots of challenges in there, I think, right? To get this over the hill. But this is super, super fascinating. So the procedure of how we work in these discussions is, so please, everybody who has a question, has a comment, maybe in the chat, just say, I have a question, whatever, and then I take it in that sequence. Who wants to start? Okay, Nina.
Yeah, just to, I have so many kind of maybe more detailed questions, but I think this is an amazing project, and kind of maybe the very first question that comes into my mind is actually what is the major challenge that you are kind of having right now? Because this is a huge project, and I think that also kind of as you said, kind of reaching all these communities and getting people become involved with this, but maybe you have some other issues that you are kind of working on right now.
Thank you for this question. We have plenty of challenges, and one of the major challenges we're currently facing is actually how do we tell people what a function is and why is it useful for them. And that's really a big problem. I mean, a lot of people who have been trained as programmers and so on immediately understand, oh, functions are super useful in many, many different ways, right? But for people who are not trained as programmers, it's actually very, very hard to understand that they could be using functions all the time and that they could be useful in all kinds of circumstances and so on. And the goal of actually having a lot of people who are not already developers contribute to Wiki Functions hinges on the idea that we actually can sell the potential of what those are. So we're trying to work with different metaphors, like functions are question answering devices, and they can answer many more questions. So it's kind of a question answering site that automatically answers your questions, and where everyone can contribute to the answering of this question. And this is one of the metaphors we're trying currently out, where we're developing towards. the other challenge is to have a UX which is actually understandable by a lot of people, where a lot of people can contribute across languages, again, without being already developers. Because what we believe is that in order to get support for 300, 400 languages, we need to make it as easy as possible to contribute for people who are not already coders. Because often the people who are coders in language are not the ones who really have sufficient working understanding of the language in order to write those renderers that we need. So the main focus this year, we are really putting on the challenge of how to make Wiki Functions something where a lot of people in a diverse environments all around the world can actually contribute to. We're making sure that Wiki Functions will be accessible from mobile. We'll make sure that Wiki Functions will be accessible in all the kind of different languages and so on. Next year, we'll get to the very challenging thing is, does this idea actually even work? Like, not just about functions, but can we represent content in a language abstract manner and have it being displayed in hundreds of different languages? Will this create whole articles and so on? So yeah, but this is something that we just have to try out in order to figure it out. It's kind of close to, the idea of a universal language that can represent all the information in the world, which has been tried in human history a few times by people who are much, much smarter than any of us here. And they have all failed, right? So another big challenge is, why do we believe that it's possible this time, and how do we actually achieve it? And here the answer is that we're actually not being as ambitious as many of our predecessors. We're not trying to formally capture the content of what people are saying. We're not trying to semantically encode the content and be able to reason over it. We're just trying to find an abstract representation that can be translated with a high fidelity in the different languages. And the question is this sufficient enough to avoid the mistakes of our predecessors and not to fall in the same trap? We'll see. I really don't know the answer to that one, but those are some of the big challenges. Oh, the third one, just to add this, would be how many constructors do we actually need to represent a decent amount of natural language? If the number of constructors is very small, we're golden, everything is fine, because then writing renderers will be easy. You just need a small set, you need a small number of people to do that. But if the number of constructors goes into tens of thousands or millions, we basically will be the same problem that we are right now, and languages that don't have content will continue not to have content because, well, we don't have to construct the renderers to actually create the natural language in those languages. So, and this is again something that we have no idea how many of those we will need, how many of those different types of frames we'll need in order to express the English Wikipedia, how many of them need to be available in order to provide more content in many different languages. Something we have to try out and figure out, and then hopefully get enough of a community to do that. And this all turns back to this original problem. We need a decent size, we need a decently diverse community in order to reach as many people as possible. So the biggest challenge really boils down, in all of those things, boils down to getting enough of a community of contributors who can work in many different languages together on the side.
Thank you. So I got many questions on the way, but I want to give everybody the chance in the chat. So Mike Tom, you have a question.
Yes, actually, well, first of all, it was really, well, quite an impressive story and quite a huge project, and it is, well, impressive and a little bit frightening, and in a sense that the whole volume of what you are trying to do is quite impressive. But I have a, well, sort of a stupid question. It seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that at least in part of what you are trying to do, you are actually in competition with, well, automatic translation services which already exist, because I mean for the part of the data when Wikidata, when it is indeed, well, a set of basically connections between concepts, then it is quite clear that it must be incredibly useful. But as soon as you go to the processing of natural language these constructions and on things like this, we are basically competing with people who open the English Wikipedia article about Marie Curie and putting it in through Google Translate. And can you a little bit speculate about why you think your approach is more useful than that, and what are the problems with that one which you are trying to avoid, or something like this?
Yes, sure. So in the end, I hope that machine translation will get to a point where it's good enough to actually do what we're trying to do here. The thing is, I started on this project about a decade ago, like early 2010s. And back then it looked like, oh, another year or two. It looks like, I mean, the successes in machine translation have been so huge and so fast that I thought it won't take long until we actually have machine translation, which is precise enough, which is good enough to actually cover the content and do what we're hoping for. And today, machine translation has become so much better than it was a decade ago, than it was 2 decades ago. It's incredible, the progress. And I really hope that we will get to a point where we don't need Abstract Wikipedia for these things. But by now, I also see it's actually not that soon. So there is a window of opportunity where Abstract Wikipedia can provide a lot of knowledge to many languages. The machine translation isn't there yet. Even Google Translate supports, I think, 120, 130 languages. Wikipedia is available in 300 languages. So that's a factor of 3 bigger. In small languages, machine translation has the problem of bootstrapping. It doesn't have enough data to actually say. And one-shots in different, it's a hot research topic. And hopefully we will get there. But I doubt that we will get there fast enough to provide high quality translations. And one thing is also with machine translations, they often have errors, and they're good enough in order to get the gist what's going on. But if for example, someone gets a diagnosis from the doctor, and they go to Wikipedia to read about this thing, a missing negation can be really, really important. And this is the kind of precision that machine translation still doesn't have. I mean, I had translations from Central Asian language, Uzbek. My wife is from Uzbekistan, from Uzbek to English, and it was just dropping a negation here or there. And this is like kind of important. It's good enough to get the gist of ideas. It's good enough to take a recipe and translate it between different languages. But we're not at the point yet where I could take a Wikipedia article from Chinese and have it confidently be translated into Estonian and be just say, here, you can read this. And I don't think we will get there within the next 5 years, maybe even 10 years, especially not for 300 languages we want to support. On the other side, if Abstract Wikipedia is there and it's even a moderate success, I actually think we will speed up the time to get machine translation to the place where it can be, because we can actually create parallel corpora in different languages and we can train. And maybe this will help with, filling in the gaps for the next 200 languages in machine translation. And maybe it can help in increasing the correctness and the precision of those translations. So in the end, I completely agree with you. Machine translation is is where I hope that we will land, and we will be able just to enter content in any language. It will be available in all of the different languages and so on, and everything is golden. But I'm afraid that it takes it would take longer than I hope for, and there's this window of opportunity where we can provide hundreds of millions of people with knowledge that we currently don't have. So it's a stopgap measure, but I think it's a very helpful stopgap measure, and it can help with speeding things up. But in the end, yes, I agree that machine translation is the way to go. And I hope that Abstract Wikipedia will get
but anyway, there are formal things which connecting concepts with each other, that there is sort of a formal structure of things which is probably the right thing to do to do it in the core thing in a language independent way. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe you can extend a little bit. There is this other, maybe machine translation gets better through the presence of something like that. So there's a precedent, right, which is freebase.com, which sort of is now sort of like forked into the Google Knowledge Graph, and is that forked into because it's enriched with, I don't know, we can only read the tea leaves from outside of Google, but something like the ClueWeb crawl, where they looked for all the instances of all the Freebase entities in all the web, and then sort of like probably trained the knowledge graph. So in a sense, you're not only providing translations if this works out, but you're also providing a training set for machine translation that is highly, highly valuable. And I think one question sort of like the editing public probably would have is, how can this public good or public value that is created stay public and not be something that is combined with, say, the crawls and large search engine companies that sort of like take that training set and just have a massive advantage corresponding with, say, the broader public and having a small computer or something. So how we can deal with that? Like how is this not just public value, but how can this stay public value and like really benefit people?
Yeah, I find this an important question. It's the same questions that we had with Wikidata. Like, aren't we just creating structured data which will be which will then be useful for the big tech companies? Like, isn't this just something that Apple, that Google, that Bing will be deriving benefit from, and that's it? And it's the same answer as with Wikidata, actually. So yes, I expect and in some way hope that companies like Google or Apple and so on will use Wikifunctions, will use Abstract Wikipedia, will continue to use Wikidata for their benefit, and that's okay. But the thing is, those companies already could have done it without Wikidata. They could do it without Abstract Wikipedia. The machine translation team at Facebook and Google and Microsoft, all of them have already access to huge corpora of web spider and crawl data. They already can do all these things. What we are providing is something, for example, Wikidata, that we're making actually knowledge graphs accessible to much smaller organizations than Google is or than Apple is. We're making it available for startups. We're making it available for students in our universities. We're making it available for open source projects. We're making it available to NGOs who don't have a few million to run and start a process of creating their own knowledge graph, of creating their own huge large function libraries and so on. We really want to democratize access to knowledge and make it accessible to many, many more people than they currently have. That this means that we're also making it easier for the large tech companies. Well, it's part of the thing. It's just like with Wikipedia, the large tech companies can use Wikipedia and can derive benefit from it. But more importantly, all of us can too. We can go and read those Wikipedia articles. We can read it in many more places now and so on. And this is basically what I'm hoping for, to create an ecosystem where not only the large tech companies have access to this, but everyone does, because Wikipedia, Wikidata, Wikifunctions, Abstract Wikipedia, all of these are public resources that everyone can easily use. That is much easier to use than, the first thing we have to do is crawl the web and then run a MapReduce on the content from the web. You don't have to do this kind of technological investment, but you can just go and you can be a single high schooler and start writing a small project in JSON, and you have the whole world of Wikidata accessible, and you can query it, and you can just create a Sparkle query, and you can get beautiful visualizations, which otherwise would take I don't know what kind of effort you would need to do in order to get this visualization otherwise. So we're making it possible and accessible, in particular for the smaller ones. For the big companies, we're making it a bit cheaper in some places. But as I said, they already had this kind of operations. There was a Google Knowledge Graph before they had the Wikidata. Before they had Wikidata available, they already put this kind of investment into it and started using it. And the same thing for the other big companies. So yes, it will also be used by the big tech companies, but in the end, we're democratizing it and making it accessible to many more organizations, to many more individuals than before. And I hope that this kind of balances this out.
Yes, thank you very much. So there is a question in the chat by Marco Grobelnik, who's next, and then Tasvir raised his hand. So Marco, please.
Yeah, actually, Danny, just one quick question. Do you have an estimate what would be the necessary number of constructors or functions, some kind of building blocks, so that you would be able to capture critical amount of content, right? So I'm sure there's some kind of breaking point at some point, which would be, let's call it, sufficient, right? It's a long tail which we cannot reach, really, right? But there's still some number of which would be kind of sufficient. And is this in a scope of visibility of your capacity of the team or community? So are there any estimates on this?
That's a great question. It's really a make or break question for the whole project. So we did some kind of Wizard of Oz testing. We took the FrameNet set of constructors that they have, and we used it on like a number of Wikipedia articles to see how good is the coverage of what we get here. Is this like, would that be interesting enough to see? And the results came out like, so FrameNet has, I think, about 500 or something different frames, and they covered many Wikipedia articles pretty decently. So you could look at the history articles and so on and get like a good coverage on like 90% of the sentences or something like that. Now, the problem is, so we know that with 500 we can get a pretty decent coverage, but we don't know really, can we get the crucial pieces of information, or are they like often unique and so on? And as you say, this is the usual zip law distribution of things. Yeah, we can get a lot of sentences with a small number of constructors. Do we get the actually interesting ones? Do we get actually the ones that make or break an article that can, you know, it's probably easy to say Berlin is a city in Germany with a population of that and that, but can we really capture the meaning of Berlin for the German history, for European culture and so on with those sentences? I don't know. The other problem is that taking existing articles and trying to tag them with such a library is, I think, is actually an interesting exercise, but not necessarily provide us with what we need, because once you have such a library of constructors and you use it to create the text, your text changes. You try to be creative to write text with the tools that you have at hand, and this can make which is why we're not taking, for example, we're starting with the English Wikipedia and we're taking this text and trying to translate it. No, we're trying to build the thing from scratch. All of the content in Abstract Wikipedia will be built completely from scratch using the constructors that are there. And I think we will get to a very different space that in terms of what we're actually covering and describing. And the crucial question is like, is this a useful space where we get into it? And how many constructors do we need for this? And so I really have no idea what the answer to your question is. I really don't know. We'll probably know in 2 or 3 years a much better answer, obviously. But my gut intuition is that we're actually with probably a few hundred constructors, not even thousands, just hundreds. We will get to a surprisingly interesting baseline of knowledge for a lot of languages. We will.
How many do you have? How many do you have at the moment?
Nothing, because the project hasn't started yet.
Okay. No, because this is economic-wise, right, or resource-wise, right? One of the key questions, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So as said, if we look at similar projects like FrameNet, they get away with about 500, 600 constructors. So this is probably a good question that you can get right now, as you can get it. Nice. This is why I believe that with a few hundred constructors, we can actually get pretty far.
So there's now two questions lined up, which lead in two different directions. So we will return to this stream of thought. First, we're going to switch to the other interesting gorilla in the closet, which is machine learning. So Tasvir Ahmad has a question.
Should I ask?
Yes.
Okay, so my question is about the implementation of your model. As we are doing the something like machine translation and the recent machine translation models that the big tech companies or the machine translation that is being used is like transformers, GPTs, and BERTs, bidirectional encodings, and these. So I want to ask that what kind of implementation method you used you are used or going to use for this book?
You'll be so disappointed. We are using actually completely symbolic approaches for the natural language generation, and that are written by community members. So something like BERT or GPT has the problem that you can't easily go and edit it. If you would expose BERT's weight somehow, you can't go in and say, oh yeah, I need to change those weights in order to get this different output now. Or something. This is just not how those systems work, right? But we are having here a wiki. We want people to actually see, oh, there's something wrong, and then they should have a decent ability to actually figure out what do they need to click, like 1 or 2 clicks, and then go in and change the system so that they can fix the problem. And we believe this is only possible with symbolic approaches, where we have the actual function writing the natural language generation and so on, and the function being some piece of function composition that they can actually go in and understand and edit and fix. So this doesn't mean we're not going to use ML at all. There are several ways we will be using ML, but they're not really core to Wiki Functions and Abstract Wikipedia. They will be like on top of the whole system where we can have support. For example, we plan to use ML to have to make the input easier, so that you can input natural language text and then get for a classifier which makes suggestions of what are the constructors that are being built together, and then you can, as a human, go in and then still update those things and improve it. Another thing that has become very interesting in the last few months is actually to look at systems like Codex from OpenAI and others, and for Wiki Functions to actually, take the description of a function and provide you an implementation in Python or JavaScript or something like that. And then you can go in and say, okay, let's test this, let's take a look at this and improve on this, and then add it to Wiki Functions. So basically what we are looking for in deep learning models and the application is to improve and make it easier to contribute content to Wiki Functions, to contribute content to Abstract Wikipedia. And for this, ML will be useful because here we still have the human in the loop while editing the whole thing, and then it's not on the side of actually creating the output where we need people to be able to go in and change it. Another option that we are potentially thinking about, but not exactly there yet, is that you could use pretty simple natural language generation algorithms to produce something like a skeleton for the text, but then use machine learned cleaning up over the system in order to actually create nicely readable text. So to have, for example, the anaphor creation being done by something like a deep learning model, or to have morphology and agreement be something that is done by the deep learning model to make the text more fluent, to make it more readable after the content has been created. And so in order to avoid, hallucination and other issues that DL sometimes have into natural language generation. But it's something it's a little bit out of my own comfort zone, and we'll try to see if this kind of things fit together, probably working with external research institutes on this and similar. But where I really see DL models helping us at first is in the input side of things. So we use DLs for classifying the issues that the people want to bring in, and then create candidates, and then have humans take a look at them, edit them, improve them, and then put them into Wiki Functions. So we put them into Abstract Wikipedia. Does this make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. So I have a snarky follow-up question, which is in a grand scheme of things, machine learning models, like if I feed an image to a machine learning model and it tells me it's a cat that is depicted, that's also a function, right? So do you expect people, other than like sort of defining the function multiplication or blah, 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 passive for verb, there will be people who will be itchy to put like the entire bird model as a kind of entry in there. So is that something, does it scale to that being possible? In other words, will you replace Mathematica and Wolfram language with something that is now Wikipedia open?
I would hope so, yes. So there's some technical issues in getting like huge models like BERT and so on, easily running behind the functions and so on. But I would hope that this would be actually possible, that we could have machine learned models being run for implementations of functions. And I think that would actually be pretty cool because, in that case, Wiki Functions provides you a very simple interface to actually access the power of those machine learned models, and where you can then simply go ahead and upload a picture and ask, oh, is there a cat in that or not? Which is something which is out of reach, I would say, for most of us today. So if we could, abstract away all these things of training and launching and maintaining machine learned models behind a simple interface like Wiki Functions, I'd be super happy with that. Yeah, totally.
Thank you very much. The next one is Daniel Schwabe.
Hi, Denny.
Hi, Daniel.
Nice talk, and I'm happy to see how it's progressing. Now, it seems to me that the key thing, actually beyond the functions themselves, are the constructors, right? Because that's really where you start forming the senses that you need. So in that sense, this reminds me of the psych approach. And unfortunately, I should say, I don't think psych has been so successful in this goal of, I don't know, let's call it universality. So do you see this parallel between that and the constructor approach you're proposing? Have you considered, lessons learned from psych?
Yeah.
Before I go on, I'd like to suggest another use for, I don't know if you've thought about for machine learning, but thinking of GPT-3 now being used to generate code, right? So one could use GPT-3 like systems where people would say things, and you would generate compositions of constructors, which I assume is possible, right?
I hope so.
Right, you need to be able to compose them.
Yes, may I check one thing? So these are two very interesting questions. There are some of us who are old enough to know what SICK is, but I think the majority of people in the room and maybe a broader audience doesn't know that. But I think this is a very, very, very interesting sort of concern you have, and maybe one of you two could explain exactly what the Open SICK project was, because
I'll leave it to Denny to
Sure.
as part of your.
okay.
So I quickly answered the second one.
You
Yes,
can address the key issues there.
I quickly answered the second one first. So yes, we are definitely looking into using GPT-3 based coding things like Codex, for example, to actually create and suggest implementations for the functions that we have. So I think particularly the last few months have shown a lot of promise in those code generation approaches that they have. And it would be great if we could actually use those, if we could use those systems in Wiki Functions in order to create implementations. So yes, we definitely want to look into that. And we hope to discuss things, and we hope to be able to put this together, because this would help with one of the big problems that we have, like how do we let people who are not already coders create implementations? And if we can just create them automatically and then suggest to the users, this might make it so much easier for the contributors to actually create more functions, to create more implementations and add them to the system. So we definitely want to work in this direction. We don't have the expertise about this on the team. So I hope that we will actually be able to work with external research institutes on that, and in order to tie this together with Wiki Functions. It's not that it has to be in the core of Wiki Functions itself, but it would make a great system on top of it to create those things and to make it easier to edit Wiki Functions and make contributions there. So I would love for this to happen. That this would be great. Back to Psych. So what is Psych? Psych is a project that has been started by Doug Leonard about half a century ago, if I remember my history correctly, and it's still going strong. The goal is to create a large knowledge base that can that can reason about all kind of knowledge. And they do this through basically Lisp code that is written to do reasoning in form of microtheories. So you enter information into it. It can you ask questions, and it can do a lot of reasoning in order to answer those questions, because it understands the content of it, and it can have all this kind of theories. So it would understand things like, if I'm on the board of a company, then I have a certain interest in the well-doing of the company, and this might lead to a conflict of interest, for example, if I'm also in a political piece, and so you can discover this kind of things. It has been used successfully in places like understanding terror organizations. Actually, we have Marco here. Marco, why don't you quickly introduce Psych?
Yeah. Well, by the way, today Doug Leonard has birthday, if they didn't mean anything, right? Yeah, Psych. We had Psych Europe here in Ljubljana for like 10 years or more. Yeah, so at the end, it's one huge logic-based ontology, right? It's like 300,000 concepts interlinked with 2,000 materialized relations and like 50,000 theories, right? Theory would be relation, but encoded in first-order logic. So this is roughly definition of, you can see this as a giant knowledge graph, but most of it, it's not materialized, not encoded, right? So it's inferred. So this makes Psych strong on one side, and on the other side, this makes Psych weak, right? Because this reasoning might not be easy to detect whether 2 points are connected, really. So this is at the end, it's reasoning. So I think the ambition is kind of similar to Abstract Wikipedia, but on the other side, less pragmatic. So effectively, I mean, again, this is beneath the Psych. At the end, there are like 4 priests of Psych, 4 ontologies, which pretty much were aligned, and they built core of the Psych, right? So, and it was really didn't scale. The approach didn't scale, although whatever they did, I think it's a great experience for people like us thinking about psych, right? So we can learn a lot from psych in a positive and negative sense, right? So it's not just negative, yeah, psych is still alive, right? And apparently lives well on commercial projects as well. They're still there, but they use psych for, I don't know, semantic search, for kind of domain-specific reasoning type of tasks. This is how much I know what's happening these days. There were a couple of trials to commercialize it. None of them succeeded, as far as I know. So I would at least recommend to check the open version of Psych, the Open Psych, which is downloadable, which has this world model or ontology or
Doug himself recognizes that the Open Psych is too limited for practical purposes. I mean, I've heard him actually say that in meetings. So, but my question, just to get back to Abstract Wikipedia, right, is you know, I'm sure you're aware that all of this history, right? So there are the pitfalls, and that's what I'm asking. You know,
right?
Are you considering not falling into the same pitfalls?
So now that we answered the question, what is psych? Let's go to this pitfalls. So I think that psych mainly fell into the same pitfall that also, for example, Leibniz fell into, and that Raymond de Slow fell into with their own projects of creating a universal language. They not only wanted to create a universal language, they also wanted to make it reasonable. They wanted to understand, they wanted to automatically, mechanically derive truth from it. Right? Leibniz's famous idea was, if I express a question, if I express a statement, instead of arguing whether it's true, you can just go and calculate and figure out which one is true and which is not. Calculemos. And this is exactly where I say, no, we're not doing that. Representing the content of natural language is super hard. Representing semantic models that are reasonable is also super hard. Those are two super hard problems, and we can actually split them apart. What Psych is doing, it's trying to be a reasonable knowledge base in order to answer novel questions on top of knowledge when it comes in. What Abstract Wikipedia is doing is we want to represent the content of a Wikipedia article in a way that can be translated into different natural languages with high confidence. We're not trying to understand what is being said in those sentences. If I have something like in the Wikipedia article for Marie Curie, for example, there's a beautiful paragraph which describes how Pierre and Marie Curie courted each other, how they became a couple and all of these things. In order for Psych for this to work, you need a theory of mind of these two, you need a theory of, you know, romantic relationship, all of these things, emotions and all these things. For Abstract Wikipedia, we don't need any of those things. What I need are the words for those emotions in the different languages, and I hope that they map sufficiently they can actually translate into different languages. But I don't need to understand that if a person likes another person, they care for this person, that they want this person to be close to them, and so on. I don't have the theories about it. Psych does. And I just want to be able to represent this surface text and be able to translate into different languages, which is a hard problem by itself, but far not as hard as creating, you know, semantic models of those which are reasonable and which can be used for those things. So, and I'm not trying to diss the goal of Psych here. I think that goals of Psych are admirable. They're really hard, and it would be awesome if we could solve this problem. Right. It's just saying those are not my problems. Those are not the problems of Abstract Wikipedia. We're not trying. The Abstract Wikipedia will not be able to automatically discover, for example, oh, there's a disagreement, or there's an inconsistency in the text here. If in the beginning of the article you say that person has been born in 1500, and then you go on with, and then in 1700 they made this discovery.
You translate the inconsistency to another language.
Exactly. So we're basically translating to a formal language, but we're not understanding it. We're not making it reasonable. We're not automatically being reasoning about it and discovering those inconsistencies. This is basically the trap that I think Psych fell in, that Leibniz fell in, that a lot of those previous projects have fallen in, that I'm really trying to avoid.
So this is super interesting, and I thank all of you three to be here and have this and spark this discussion this way, because I do think this is actually a very crucial issue which across all fields, from network science on one end to like the most qualitative semiotics and humanities, is actually super crucial. And so one of the interesting things which I would like to inject in this discussion is the following. So Denny has pointed out that the problem, the pitfall of the OpenSig project is that it tried to arrive at sort of these statements which are sort of like, sort of firm, right? They wanted to record relations, while he says you can actually only record assertions about relations. And that's sort of like what he sort of tried to do in Freebase, to say, it's like if we have different ideas about the birth date of Marlene Dietrich or Karl Lagerfeld, we just write them, all of them in there as our opinion, sort of, right? And so now the interesting thing about this sort of went away again, because now we access Freebase via the Google Knowledge Graph, and if you search for Karl Lagerfeld, you get one birthday. And so in a similar way, you say, oh, we built this not to reason, but it's Wikidata and it's Wiki Functions, and people will use it all over the world. And as you all know, knowledge graph modelers and knowledge retrieval experts and stuff like that, the first thing they're gonna do is reason on it. So here we need to have this question, like sort of like, how do we build a fuse into the system, sort of weapons of mass destruction wise, where people are actually told that when they start to reason that this is actually really dangerous, because this is basically automated conspiracy theory, sort of, right? And so the question is, how do we actually deal with this? How can we actually make sure that people actually see that when there is this kind of stuff going on, where you have stuff in multiple languages, like information may be already there in multiple languages, we produce language in even more languages. Like, for example, how do you then, which one of the statements to use, the English one, the German one, or stuff like that? So how do we deal with this? How can we raise flags where we say, okay, so here, like if I would reconstruct the building, for example, this would be something like that. Here is the ruin, here's the actual original sort of record of the real world. Here is a reconstruction which has been done by somebody who thinks that's how it looked like. Like here, we use the machine to construct this text, but then once one starts to reason, there needs to be probably some legal licensing model that we can actually make sure that once the machine created text makes it out into some third parties, like into a news item that may start a war or not, it needs to be marked out that this is actually based on some kind of sort of symbolic function, which has not gone through human reason. I think that is a really, really important problem, and that is where a huge problem in the application lies, which probably many people, not only in information science, but also in the humanities, would write PhDs about in 15 years if stuff goes right or if stuff goes wrong. So I think now is the time that we need to think about like what actually can go wrong, and I think it's actually a lot. So the question is like, how do we address this? Like have you thought about this?
Yes. So to make it very clear, and also to record my statement publicly, I'm absolutely not against using this kind of information for reasoning. I'm not against people trying to build semantic models on top of that and then trying to find inconsistencies or trying to answer more questions and so on. I think that those would be admirable goals, and it would be great if people did that. What I don't want to do is to tie my criteria for success to having a reasonable semantic formal model of the content of Wikipedia, because I think that's too hard. I want to make myself independent of that condition. If someone else, if the community and so or whoever manages to create a formal model on top of that, manages to say, okay, here are the semantic models that can now explain even this little part of the Wikipedia and so on, I'm actually thinking that would be amazing. That would be great. I would be all for that. If they can take just the Wikipedia articles about chemistry and be able to build a model, or even take a model from OpenPsych and connect it to or from Psych proper and connect it to the Abstract Wikipedia content base. Awesome! I totally expect this will going to happen for the next 5 years, and I see PhD theses and papers on conferences doing this kind of thing. That's great. I don't want to discourage this kind of thing, but I really don't want to tie myself to having a complete and consistent semantic model that can be reasonable to all of Wikipedia. So I think that would be just too hard, and it's also not necessary for the goal that we have. And we already have ambitious goals, so why tie ourselves to even more ambitious goals? We can provide a platform where others can jump from. We can provide the shoulders, for people who are who want to work on this. And it's the same thing we did with Wikidata. In Wikidata, we have the pretty simple data model. Not as simple as RDF, but comparatively simple. And people like Daniel actually and other people have been working on models to make this more consistent, to make this more powerful, to use the data from Wikidata in a more consistent way. We throw a wrench into it and say, well, if you have different birth dates, similar to what you were describing for Freebase, if you have different birth dates for different people, that's the way it is. We just provide this information. Daniel wants to go and analyze the history of the Wikidata article, make this accessible, and help people in guidance to figure out which one of those are more reliable, which one of those more useful, how to use the references and so on. And I think this is exactly what the goal of Wikidata is, to provide this raw source that then other people can do smarter things on top of that, and then we can build even bigger constructs. And the same thing will be true for Abstract Wikipedia. We will provide this raw set, which is good enough for our purpose of creating more Wikipedia articles. And then other people will create beautiful theories on top of that, powerful reasoning systems, powerful semantic systems. And I want to be in a place where I support this and where we can, but I'm definitely not in a place where I will say, what you're doing with our data is right or wrong. This is not a place for the project. It's the same thing with Wikipedia. We're not going to decide if you use a Wikipedia article and display it next to a commercial entry, then you're wrong or something. So we don't want to have a license. We want to make a license that makes it easy to reuse this data, because I think then we will have more interest and it will make we will discover new ways of using these things. But but we don't want to have a license that restricts people from using it and make implications. I see that Daniel's hand is up.
Yeah, in this sense, the same way that Wikidata actually represents claims by different actors, different people about certain things, right? And it doesn't choose which one is right or wrong. It just claims, right? So in the same sense, you could have alternative translation into abstract. So abstract versions, abstract functions or constructors that represent an article, which would be equivalent in some sense of alternative translations that different people will translate in a different way, right? And you would not want necessarily to have one as saying, this is the translation, like the Bible, for example, right? But rather have many of those with enough, I suppose, provenance data that whoever wants to use have enough information to say, I prefer this translation or this version to that one, and so on. Is this how you envision this this whole framework is going to work?
Yes, that's exactly how I hope that this will be working. That people will create competing semantic theories on top of that, of parts of the data.
No, I didn't mean the theories. I didn't mean the theories. I meant the actual functions or constructors, right? So I have an article. The article becomes a huge, or either one or a set of compositions of constructors, right? Which represent the abstract text, right? Now, yeah. There can be competing compositions depending on how you map the functions and the constructors to the original language, right?
Yes.
So without assigning any semantics beyond the choices that have been made in making this translation, you could make those, all of them available like Wikidata does, and, right. And let the the user look at them. Then, as you said, somebody can reason about each one of them, do whatever they want over them to decide which one to use, to compare, whatever.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I'd like to see this kind of multitude of translations. I would call it a theory if you have a translation to a semantic model. So I would basically call this translation a theory. But you don't have to.
I see.
Yeah, because it's basically saying, okay, these kind of constructors seem to be encoding the following semantic relation, different from a semantic. But yeah, but I totally agree with you. This is exactly what I would like to happen, and I would like to happen to be able to either have this inside of Wiki Functions or also outside of it. It doesn't really matter, right? I mean, in the end, the data will be available for everyone, and then you can have all these translations, and whatever is useful will hopefully win. That's the basic idea.
Do you have negation?
Well, now you're asking too much, Daniel.
No, I'm kidding. Actually, is there questions from the rest of the audience which may take us in a completely different direction? But yes, thank you very much. This is super interesting so far. Yes.
But to make it a negation one, well, it will obviously be possible to state a negation in the. I mean, you must be able to say that. I don't know. I mean, there are negations in Wikipedia, obviously, so we must be able to capture those. But this is exactly where the point comes in that Daniel just mentioned. We don't have to have a semantic theory of negation. We don't have to decide, if it's negation as failure or if this is an open world negation or whatever. We don't have. The only thing we have to do is, if you use the word not in an English sentence, we need to be able to represent it somehow, and we need to know how to translate to Portuguese, we need to know how to translate to Estonian and so on, and that's it. But we don't need to understand what this negation means, if it maps to the negation in formal logics, if it maps to whatever. And people can come in and create those translations and say, okay, if we have this negation here that gets translated to English and like that, now let's see how this works out and what happens if I do this kind of different translations into different formal theories of negation. But
yeah,
we
but
don't have to
you translate it never rains in Southern California.
Exactly. And then we just look at the data, it's like, oh yeah, it does rain here. So we will definitely have something that looks like a negation in natural language. And I expect us to have many translations into formal theories for that.
The units in MIT to raise their hand.
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. I have a bit of a different question, more about the users who would be producing the texts, and just trying to figure out exactly how that would work, because of course now with Wikipedia we have people writing texts in different languages, and of course already we see inequalities in the knowledge being produced around the world because of this access that people may or may not have to, let's say, computers, or even, being able to compose texts. Now, when we add this additional layer of producing constructors as well, I think at some point you mentioned that you would also allow users to create those constructors or write those functions. And then, of course, not everyone, is able to code in different languages. And at some point, you also mentioned that there would be perhaps this symbolic system that allows users to create those functions. Yet still, I would imagine that not everyone might be able to use this symbolic system even, regardless of whether they have to code to be able to create the functions. And I just wonder whether you had any thoughts on how that then may influence what type of articles are written, or how accessible the Wikipedia becomes for the users to create knowledge because of this added layer of having to understand how to write those functions. Thank you.
Yes, I think this is really a crucial question for us, and we are putting a lot of our resources into trying to avoid falling to a trap where we're basically creating an even louder echo chamber for a particular demographic to create knowledge, to spread knowledge, and to colonialize knowledge of other languages even more than we currently already have. So we are trying very hard to make our UX accessible to a lot of people, to make sure that we are not accessible only through big screens, but also through mobile interfaces. We want to make sure that the creation of constructors, the creation of renderers in different languages will be possible on mobile, will be understandable for people who don't have a coding background, for people who don't speak English. So, because the goal really is that, you know, I would be super unhappy if in 3 years, the history of the Congo would be written by Belgian teenagers. I think it would be a terrible result. I have nothing against Belgian teenagers, but I think that the history of the Congo really should also be written by people who live in the Congo, by people who are actually part of the history, whose own history is the history of the country. And I want to have more people contributing their voices to this common knowledge base. So it's super important for us to make it accessible for as many people as possible, and not only to the people of who have easy web access. It is already the case that, for example, if you are in the Hungarian or the Estonian or the Japanese Wikipedia, that most of the time you actually have only authors that have nothing to do with the Congo, who are writing about the Congo in those languages, obviously, because not a lot of people in the Congo know how to write Estonian articles. And insofar, I hope that this common abstract knowledge base, where everyone can contribute to, will actually lead to a world where more voices will be heard in more spaces. So I'm not saying that we will completely avoid of falling into this trap. This won't be possible, obviously. But I think we will allow much more than it is right now for a person to actually lend a voice to a description about their own culture, about their own history, and be available everywhere around the world. And not just, you know, if they choose to write it in either the native language, or if they choose maybe to write it in French or English, but usually that's it, where those voices can be heard today. In the future, I would be happy if actually contributions from people in Africa would actually also be read on the Estonian Wikipedia, for example. And this is something that in the present we almost don't have. So yeah, I'm not promising that I'm going to solve this problem. We won't become suddenly an equitable world where everyone contributes equally to the knowledge base. But I think that with Abstract Wikipedia, we can make the problem a bit better than it currently is. And we are putting a lot of effort in getting this as right as possible. But I'm definitely not promising that we will solve this issue. But I just hope that we'll make it a little bit better, basically.
I'm sorry. May I?
Mike, sorry.
No, I just tiny reformulation of what Denny just said, just to make sure that I understood him correctly. That basically, as far as I understand, the idea of what you are trying to do is that right now, knowledge from one, say, small Wikipedia to another small Wikipedia is essentially going through English or through one of big languages. And what I'm trying to do is actually make a direct connection between, I don't know, Congo and Estonia, for example, yes?
Yes, this is part of that. I mean, if this translation is happening today at all, it goes through one of the big languages. More often than not, it doesn't happen at all. So having this direct way of contributing to the common knowledge base and make it available in all these different languages, hopefully will remove this barrier much more than it currently is. Yes, I agree with what you say.
Okay, thank you very much. Mila.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about, are you somehow going to like merge articles in different languages? I mean, like there are often cases that there are already some kind of like articles in different languages, and maybe one of them is kind of like more extensive and the other one is maybe smaller, but also kind of like, for instance, a Polish article on Marie Curie might contain more detailed information on her kind of like Polish relations and origins and so on, while the French version might contain some others kind of like in relation to her life in Paris, or other similar examples. So how would you then kind of like, are you somehow planning to merge these? And of course, I would assume that for a Polish reader, often kind of the information concerning kind of like her Polish roots might be somehow more relevant than for a French reader, for instance. And how are you going to deal with this? And later, I also started to think that kind of like, have you been somehow thinking how this kind of like does your project somehow lead the contents to change somehow? If you're kind of like, have you been like thinking of this? Yeah.
Yes, those are all very important questions. So first, we're not going to replace the current Wikipedias. If there's already an article in a Wikipedia, this is going to stay. We're not going to remove that one. So particularly for articles that are relevant to a given culture, like for example, the article about Marie Curie in Polish, I expect they will have their own write-up. You can always locally overwrite content from Abstract Wikipedia. So if there's stuff, if the Polish prefer to have their own article about Marie Curie, if the Hebrew Wikipedia prefers to have their own article about Jerusalem, that's totally okay, and they can keep that. We don't have any plans about how content from the local articles will move to Abstract Wikipedia. That's completely up to the communities and how to agree that. So we don't foresee at all, like, for example, how contributors from the Croatian and Serbian Wikipedia might write together the article of Nikola Tesla. Up to them to figure that out and how to put it. But they will also have the local articles in Croatian, in Serbian, and they don't need to go back to Abstract Wikipedia. So this is all completely up to the communities. I do hope that more information than now will move from the local Wikipedias to Abstract Wikipedia, because my end goal would be to have a comprehensive, neutral view of all the information that is available in the different languages. I would hope that this will happen, but I have no idea how much of it will actually happen and at what speed and all these things. Will Abstract Wikipedia change the local Wikipedias? Well, one thing that we will have is, that 1 or 2 clicks away from the current Wikipedia article, for example, if we have a Hebrew article on Jerusalem, 2 clicks away will be the Hebrew rendering of the common article for Abstract Wikipedia. So then the reader, if they're really interested, they can just go and compare what does the Abstract Wikipedia say about this. And coming from a Croatian Wikipedia background, so the Croatian Wikipedia had in the last decade or so had an issue that there were a lot of right-wing editors who have taken over the project and who had a different view on certain historical events than I would, for example, endorse, and certainly different than it was said in the English Wikipedia. And if a Wikipedia gets hijacked, it's first hard to discover that, especially in a smaller language, and it's hard to break that up if there is an actual local community who supports and pushes that. But now, at least, for people who are really interested, it would be just a click or two away to see what a common Wikipedia says, and then they can say, oh wait, this is actually very different than what I have in my local Wikipedia. And there are 2 ways to resolve this difference. I have Either you change your local article, or you go to the abstract article and try to change your common knowledge about this. And both of those would lead to an interaction between the knowledge in those two those representations, which would lead hopefully to an improvement and general more neutral point of view in the world on those things. So I'm optimistic. I always think more eyeballs will lead to better content in Wikipedia. And with Abstract Wikipedia, the breaking up the sometimes small communities and making them accessible to actually interact on their content base with a global community. And hopefully this will lead to better articles overall. Whether it will work out or not, ask me in a few years. I really don't know. But I'm hopeful that it will. There are certain reasons why I believe that this is the case. One, for example, is currently for the small Wikipedias, you have contributors. If a contributor comes to Wikipedia and, for example, it's in a comparably small Wikipedia, like for example, Hausa. Okay, Hausa has a lot of speakers, but the Wikipedia is small. And then the contributor has to decide, do I actually contribute in Hausa, or do I contribute, for example, in English? Because English is a higher value language. It's a higher prestige language. And so they might decide, oh well, instead of contributing to the Hausa article on the history of Nigeria, I could contribute actually to the English article, and I will have much more readers because this is going to the whole world. So we actually cannibalize the smaller Wikipedias with the large Wikipedias. These people who can speak a higher prestige language might just go to those higher prestige languages and edit there. With Abstract Wikipedia, I hope to kind of weaken this effect, to bring more people actually to contribute to the Hausa Wikipedia and to the Abstract Wikipedia, which makes them available in Hausa than before. Another effect is that it becomes more believable for people that an encyclopedia in their language is actually a realistic goal. Because I might say in Hausa, there's so many people, so few people working on this encyclopedia is so small. Why even bother? I don't need to contribute to that because it's not gonna work anyway. And with Abstract Wikipedia, you suddenly have, oh, actually people are much more effective in creating an encyclopedia. Creating an encyclopedia that is correct, that is current, that has all this content. Maybe there's more to it, and then they can go and actually they can write on those articles they care about. They don't even have to contribute to Abstract Wikipedia. They can write in the local language then an article about the local cultures, about the local food, about the local histories, about the local places, local people, and so on. But we're bringing this knowledge all into the Wikipedia ecosystem, and then hopefully people will start, maybe some of it will meander over to Abstract Wikipedia, make it available to more languages, and so on. But I hope that particularly the smaller language Wikipedias will actually see an influx of new contributors because the goals become more realistic, become more visible, and they're not being diverted to the large Wikipedias anymore as much as they are today. So in the end, I really hope that that it will be an improvement on several fronts here because of Abstract Wikipedia.
Thank you very
but
much.
for now, it's like, but for now, it's all just hopes and dreams and so on. I really don't know how it will work out. I said, ask me in 2 or 3 years. I might have a better view then.
Thank you very much. I think there is something I would like to add. We have sort of like put the monster of colonialism on the wall, right? But we also need to acknowledge there's things like Hutu versus Tutsi in Rwanda. There's things like Ted Cruz Republicans versus regular people in Texas, right? And so we wouldn't be here if there was no Radio Free Europe, which you could also say was colonialism, but it was a sort of self-defense of free society. And I think that is sort of an interesting thing that right now, yes, we must worry about this kind of abstraction will allow for machine editing. It will allow for new forms of lobbying, which then you speak German, you're probably aware with Jan Bünnemann, who last week did something about how politicians in Germany hire for-profit companies that actually edit their Wikipedia entry, and these happen to be run by some of the top editors. So the key thing is there is problems, but at the same time, the solution sort of requires the same thing as you sort of like convincingly laid out. And so I think there needs to be an effort of the community. And the question is indeed how we can make this more easy. Like what must a user interface look like, even for people who, you know, like there seems to be this barrier, for example, that, you know, dudes edit Wikipedia. There's too little women. Why is this? This is a big question, right? And obviously this is also a culture question. And this may be something one could build into the example of Pinterest, for example, is interesting, right? Where just a little different user interface can actually sort of like sway the whole thing in the other direction. The question is like, should there be a multitude of user interfaces, which ironically is something that would be enabled by Abstract Wikipedia, which is really great. And I think that is sort of a really interesting thing. So I think this whole project is super, super fascinating. We have officially 10 more minutes. So if you still have a question, please sort of put it in the chat. There is one message in the chat, which may be for me privately. It is. Yeah, so Daniel Schwab and I have a sort of side conversation going on how awesome it would be to have a Wikipedia of these construction sets. And like one thing is that, you know, like, and I think we agree on this, that different people have different construction sets in their head, given the facts that exist, like, you know, our former neighbor in Texas thinks that it's really bad to have vaccinations, while other people, like I have, my constructor says vaccinations necessary. So that is a really interesting, important thing. But one can also think about what's the set of all possible constructors that leads to a particular statement. And that is something where all of a sudden, something that is very dear to our heart sort of goes on, where there you have obviously information theory, combinatorics, you know, sort of the math of knowledge going on one end of the spectrum. On the other end, there is the really sort of like, you know, sort of humanist librarian that goes to the library, looks at the postcard sent by the Nobel Committee to Marie Curie to check that if it's really the case that she got the Nobel Prize. So this kind of full spectrum is something which I think is important to sort of like bring into, and it's a question like, what is the possibility space there? So yeah, thank you very much there. So if there is no further questions from the audience, please raise your hand. I would end early. And maybe, Denny, you want to say something at the very end, like something like, what do you expect from the community, from particularly communities like us, like scholarship? What kind of scholarship do you expect to be possible through this? And what kind of scholarship do you think would be necessary to lead to a successful outcome here?
So I obviously don't expect anything from communities, but I hope things will happen from certain communities. And for example, I hope that particularly from a community like yours, I hope that this project will be looked at critically in order to figure out how we can do damage, like what could go wrong, because we should avoid that, right? You mentioned colonialism. This is something where we should be really careful, not in order to become just an enabler of more colonialism in the 21st century. It's like, that wouldn't be awesome. How can we help to build a platform that is more inclusive, that allows for more diversity, that leads to more equity? All of these things I would like if we are being critically watched by smart people like you, like those that are here in this Zoom room. I also like people just to play around with it, to toy around it, to see what can happen with this, what can we do here, and figure out novel ways that this can be used, that this can be applied, and so on. My usual modus operandi is just I provide a platform, and then other people work much more interesting things on those. You just mentioned this kind of mathematics of knowledge, this combinatorics of this is everything, you know, that people much smarter than me can do on top of the platform that I provide, where the communities can work with. And I want to make sure that we provide enough raw data to make all of these things possible, to make all of these things happening, that that we are enabling this kind of research and exploration and playing in order to figure out what is interesting. We will have so many challenges on the way, and I don't think we have half of the answers at this point. We're trying to be pragmatic. We're trying to have a lot of the work, like, for example, the machine learned work, which was discussed in the beginning, the semantic theories of the content, which have been discussed midways and so on, that we won't be providing, but I would love to see those still happen outside of what we're doing in our core. I want to focus us on what only we can do, but then I want to see all these things happening and blooming outside. And I hope that that we are enabling this, and that there will be a community working on these things, exploring it, and then the best things of those hopefully will coalesce and go back and make the system grow and become better than it could be without the help of you all. So I really want this to be an invitation for everyone to take a look, to see what they can do with this, how they can contribute, what they can build on top of this, and so that we are all working together towards, you know, our common goal of a world where everyone can have access and share in as much knowledge as possible.
Thank you very much. This is great. So I like to use as a closing word your quotation from Leibniz, that he made the mistake to build a reasonable universal language. So let's build a universal language reasonability later. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, and thanks everyone for being here.
Yes, it's great. Thank you. Bye-bye.